They say betrayal feels like a knife. For me, it was a polished oak boardroom table, my brother's smug smile, and the sound of our family name being stripped from my legacy in the click of a fountain pen. That's how you lose a crown you never even knew you wore, publicly, deliberately, and with applause. My name is Emilia Torres. I'm 29 years old. Until last week, I believed that loyalty to family was the noblest form of love. But that belief died the moment my own brother fired me, publicly, inside the company my grandfather built, the company I kept alive when no one else bothered to show up. I was still wiping my hands on a worn towel from the shop floor that morning when I got the call. Victor wanted me dressed for the boardroom by 10 a.m. He didn't even say hello. Just barked out orders like I was one of the new interns fumbling around with Excel. He always had that tone with me, the one that wrapped condescension and civility like a goddamn Christmas gift. I should have known something was wrong when I walked into the Torres and Company headquarters and every legacy employee, George, Sylvia, even old Dean from Sanding, refused to meet my eyes. The air was thick with the kind of silence that doesn't happen by accident, the kind that swells right before a storm. It was exactly 10:02 when I stepped into the boardroom. Victor was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by two freshly suited men I didn't recognize. Next to them sat our longtime CFO, Frank, shifting uncomfortably in his seat like the leather cushion might swallow him whole. The rest of the board, half old friends of my father, half recent investors Victor brought in, sat in a stiff line along the glossy walnut table. Victor didn't even let me sit. "Emilia," he said, with that rehearsed corporate warmth he wore like aftershave, "we appreciate everything you've done to keep operations going, especially during our father's health scare." Health scare. As if Dad's stroke hadn't left half his body useless and his mind fogged with permanent static. As if I hadn't been the one managing payroll, shipments, and two separate union negotiations while Victor made keynote speeches about elevating legacy industries with AI. He continued, "But we need a leadership team that's prepared to think progressively. The board has agreed that moving forward, we'll be restructuring." I didn't speak. Not at first. I was still scanning faces, trying to find one, just one, that would look me in the eye. "I'm removing you from your role as operations director, effective immediately," Victor said. "We'll, of course, offer you a generous severance package." The room didn't explode. It didn't even whisper. It just waited. Waited for me to cry. Or scream. Or beg. But I stood there, fingers trembling only slightly at my sides, and said nothing. I didn't need to. Victor hadn't just removed me from a title. He'd declared war on everything I'd protected for the last 6 years while he schmoozed with venture capitalists and posed for Forbes profiles about family business modernization. I walked out, leaving the folder I had brought, a detailed proposal to preserve artisan jobs while implementing lean manufacturing upgrades, on the table. He never even glanced at it. Outside the conference room, Sylvia caught up to me in the hallway. Her eyes were red. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "We didn't know he was going to." "Yes, you did," I said. My voice didn't shake. I was proud of that. The rest of the day passed like a dream someone else was having. I drove back to my small apartment above the bakery near 5th Street. I peeled off the stiff blazer I hated and sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular for almost an hour. Victor had fired me from the company I had run in every meaningful way since our father's stroke. And now, he would turn our grandfather's proud, calloused wood business into a hollow, algorithm-driven mockery of itself. And he would do it while shaking hands with people who didn't know a dovetail joint from a drywall screw. But what hurt most wasn't the job. It was that Victor had looked at me, really looked at me, and seen nothing worth keeping. Not the girl who used to stay up with Dad reviewing order slips. Not the woman who talked Jorge, our master carver, out of retiring by giving him part-time hours and full-time respect. Not the person who knew every corner of that shop like the lines on her own palms. I had been invisible to him long before today. This just made it official. That night, I sat with my old notebooks. I still had Dad's original blueprints, the ones with the coffee stains and pencil edits. I flipped through them slowly, letting the pages slide through my fingers like silk. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I started planning. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a betrayal, one that hums low beneath the skin like a wound too deep to bleed. That first morning after Victor fired me, I woke up at 6:15 a.m. On autopilot, already halfway to slipping into my shop apron before I remembered I no longer had a shop to go to. The fabric felt strange in my hands, suddenly foreign, like it belonged to someone else now, someone naive enough to believe that blood still meant belonging. I stood in my tiny kitchen, barefoot, surrounded by chipped tile and the scent of burnt toast I forgot to take out of the oven. The apartment had always been a temporary thing, a modest space above a bakery owned by Mrs. Lindstrom, who gave me discounted rent after my father fell ill. I used to tell myself it was practical to live close to the shop, that I didn't need more space. Now, every creaking floorboard and peeling cabinet whispered back, "You stayed small so they could feel big." For the first few days, I wandered the town like a ghost, a displaced figure haunting streets that used to feel like mine. Everywhere I went, people gave me the kind of looks you reserve for someone fresh out of surgery, polite, tight-lipped sympathy with just enough distance to avoid catching whatever misfortune I'd contracted. Some shopkeepers offered vague condolences without making eye contact, others changed the subject entirely, pretending they didn't know what had happened. But in a town like ours, where gossip travels faster than the post, everybody knew. At first, I thought I could find a new job. I polished my resume, updated my LinkedIn, and sent out applications to companies both inside and outside the county. I received 3 replies, 1 rejection, 1, "We're keeping your resume on file," and 1 painfully honest email from a small cabinetry business that said, "We respect your experience, but we don't want to get involved in Torres family politics." It hadn't occurred to me before then that my last name was a brand now, not a person, not a history, just a sticky logo that scared off opportunities. So I started looking elsewhere. Not for employment exactly, but for breath. I wandered into places I'd once passed without thought, community centers, old hobbyist meetups, the thrift store where the cashier recognized me and offered a quiet nod. One Tuesday afternoon, I stumbled into the basement of the rec hall where a local group of artisans hosted open workshops. I didn't come with any intention. I just needed to sit somewhere that didn't echo with failure. That's where I met Roy. Roy was an upholsterer in his late 60s with hands like sandpaper and a voice that sounded like he chewed gravel for breakfast. He noticed me studying the tension on his sewing machine and barked, "Either ask a question or stop staring, kid." Something in his bluntness felt like home. I asked how he got the threads to hold tight through leather. He squinted, handed me a scrap, and said, "Figure it out. You'll learn more that way." Over the next few weeks, I found myself drifting back to that basement, offering to sweep up, hand tools, or organize swatches in exchange for silence and space. Roy didn't ask many questions, which I appreciated, and when he finally did, it was only to ask why someone with a management hands gave a damn about stitching upholstery. "I used to run things," I said simply. He just nodded, like he understood the kind of loss that doesn't need full sentences. Volunteering there led me to other places, like the food shelter on 6th Street where Sylvia now helped serve lunch twice a week. She had been one of our senior floor managers at Torres & Company for almost 20 years before she took a severance and disappeared from the factory floor. When she saw me at the shelter, balancing a tray of donated bread, she didn't say a word. She just handed me an apron and squeezed my arm gently. Later that day, while folding napkins in the back room, she broke the silence. "Victor's running the place like it's a spreadsheet," she said bitterly. "He laid off the whole sanding team last week, hired machines that jam more than they cut." I winced. Those sanding teams included Jorge, who'd been with us since before I could spell wood grain. "Is he okay?" I asked. She shrugged. "He's doing odd jobs, mostly refinishing antique pieces for rich folks who don't know what a dovetail joint is." Then, more quietly, she added, "You should talk to him." So I did. I visited Jorge 2 days later at his modest garage-turned-workshop, where the air smelled like cedar and regret. He looked older than I remembered, his once quick hands slower, more deliberate. But his eyes still lit up when he talked about finishes, about depth of color, about honoring the wood's original story instead of sanding it into silence. He replaced safety-grade varnish with some cheaper import, Jorge said while polishing a table leg. "Smells toxic as hell. Told us to use masks and not be dramatic." Last month, Carlos passed out mid-shift. They called it heat stroke. My stomach turned. Victor wasn't just modernizing. He was gutting the place, trading craftsmanship for shortcuts, safety for margins, and soul for scalable growth. That night, I sat at my tiny kitchen table, surrounded by half-drunk teacups and journals filled with notes I hadn't touched in years. I pulled out an old manila folder my father once used for company origin documents. I'd kept it more out of sentiment than utility, but something about Jorge's story, about the varnish, the layoffs, the dangerous efficiency, unsettled me into action. Inside the folder were yellowed copies of incorporation papers, blueprints of the original shop lot, and a half-legible letter my grandfather wrote in 1974. It was mostly rambling philosophy about business as community, but near the end, something caught my eye, a clause circled in thick red ink in the original deed. The handwriting wasn't his. It was my father's. The clause mentioned a stipulation for equity reassessment under moral deterioration of legacy intent. What the hell did that mean? I set the papers aside, my heart beating faster than it should. I knew enough legalese to understand that this wasn't just decorative language. This was protective wording, an old-school failsafe embedded into the company's founding documents. My grandfather had always spoken about the duty of craft as if it were a religion. He believed woodworking wasn't just about products, it was about people, pride, permanence. I started journaling that night, something I hadn't done since college. Not just to vent, but to remember. I wrote down stories my father told me about his father building benches for schools even when he wasn't paid. I documented the origin of the shop floor bell, which rang every time a worker hit their 10-year anniversary. I wrote about how, during the 2008 recession, my father took a pay cut so he wouldn't have to lay anyone off. I wrote because if I didn't, the version Victor was building, the one filled with robots and branding teams and exploitative practices, would become the only version that survived. As the weeks passed, news from Torres and Company leaked like a slow drip of contaminated water. The Yelp reviews started turning sour. A longtime client posted about receiving a custom dining set with splintered edges and crooked joints. A wedding venue canceled their bulk order due to repeated delivery delays and unresponsive automated service portals. Even the local press, which once praised Victor's youthful innovation, ran a headline titled, "Legacy Lost. Torres and Company faces declining loyalty amid changes." Still, Victor pressed forward. He published LinkedIn posts with phrases like pivoting toward scale and eliminating outdated processes. He stood in clean factories, untouched by dust, smiling like a man who'd never swung a hammer. And yet, the town started to change. People began coming to Roy for repairs instead of buying new. A retired cabinet maker reopened his garage studio and hired Carlos, the same floor guy who collapsed. Mrs. Lindstrom asked if I could help redesign her pastry counter in real wood, none of that prefab crap. It was subtle. But something was shifting. So was I. I no longer walked with my eyes lowered. I no longer apologized for having too many opinions. I no longer saw myself as exiled. I was just, in between. I started visiting the city clerk's office during lunch hours, digging into old zoning files, legacy agreements, and articles of incorporation. Every time I opened a document with the name Torres, I felt like I was lighting a match in a dark room, slowly illuminating the edges of something I had never fully understood. The clause in my grandfather's deed wasn't meaningless. It was a door. And maybe, just maybe, I still had a key. When I was a child, I used to wander into my grandfather's study when no one else was looking, drawn by the scent of pipe tobacco, cedar, and leather-bound volumes of dusty business ledgers. I never dared touch anything important, just stood in the doorway, watching the way the late afternoon light kissed the ridges of his old drafting table. He would sometimes catch me there and wink over his shoulder, saying in that gravelly voice of his, "Everything worth building starts on paper, kiddo." Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. But now, years later, freshly displaced and forged by quiet fury, I finally did. Because I was about to go digging through more paper than I had ever seen in my life, buried documents, forgotten ledgers, and faded records that might hold the answer to a question I hadn't even fully articulated yet. Who really owns Torres and Company? It started with a hunch, one I couldn't shake no matter how many times I tried to tell myself that power doesn't get handed to people like me. It gets ripped away, often without warning, often by someone with a familiar face. But that clause I found in the old manila folder, the one about moral deterioration of legacy intent, wouldn't leave me alone. It felt like a breadcrumb dropped decades ago, waiting for someone to follow. So I did. I started at the county clerk's office, housed inside a red brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since fax machines were the pinnacle of innovation. The woman behind the front desk wore a name tag that read, Rita, and had the kind of permanently skeptical eyebrows that made you feel like she knew you were lying before you even opened your mouth. "I'm looking for historical property and business filings related to Torres and Company," I said, trying to sound casual but confident. Rita peered at me over her readers. "You family?" "I'm Amelia Torres, granddaughter of Manuel Torres," I said, letting the name hang in the air for a moment, like a forgotten anthem. She blinked, something almost like recognition flickering across her face, and then nodded. "Well, that gets you a little further than most." She disappeared into the back and returned with a file box that looked like it had weathered 3 administrations and a small flood. "You'll want to start with the trust filings from '89 and go from there," she said, handing me a dust mask like we were about to exhume a tomb. The next 5 hours blurred into a haze of aging paper, stiff coffee, and cramped handwriting. I found incorporation papers dated back to 1958, partnership dissolutions, equipment leases, even a few old notes in my grandfather's pen, full of looping cursive and quiet sarcasm. And then, tucked between a real estate transaction and a licensing agreement from 1994, I found it. A trust agreement. Dated August 17, 1997. I stared at the title for a full minute before I opened the folder, the hairs on the back of my neck already rising like they'd sensed a storm coming. The Torres Family Legacy Trust. I read it slowly, carefully, with the same kind of reverence I'd used dissecting a long-lost recipe passed down from someone who once knew the taste of tradition. The document was dense, full of legalese, but one section leapt out like a beacon in a storm. In the event that no full transfer of Torres and Company shares occurs during the lifetime of Manuel Torres or his direct heir, and no irrevocable shareholder agreement is signed by all siblings of the second generation, control of Torres and Company will default to the named legacy steward upon satisfaction of minimum operational commitment. I read it again. Then again. My hand started to shake. The named legacy steward was me. I was 29 now. And I had worked at Torres and Company since I was 19, full-time, through college courses, holidays, and hospital visits. I had clocked in every day while Victor was flying across the country giving TED Talks about empathetic disruption. I had made 10 years. Victor hadn't inherited majority control when our father had his stroke. He never owned it. He was squatting in my house. The next day, I made an appointment with a local attorney who specialized in generational trusts and estate disputes. Her name was Marjorie Lynn, and she had the calm demeanor of someone who had seen families tear themselves apart over porcelain china and rusted fishing cabins. I showed her the trust paperwork, my employment records, and the clause I'd found. She studied the documents in silence for a long time, tapping a red pen softly against the corner of her legal pad. Finally, she looked up and said, "Do you realize what this means?" I nodded, even though I still wasn't sure if I fully believed it. "This trust was never dissolved," she continued, flipping through the pages like a detective sifting through clues. "Your father never signed a formal succession document. Victor never submitted transfer filings. And this clause, it's ironclad. He's not the owner. He's a temporary operator, if that." She leaned forward, lowering her voice slightly as if we were being watched. "Emilia, legally speaking, you're the majority shareholder of Torres and Company. Not only that, but this trust gives you rights to demand immediate review of the company's ethics and direction under fiduciary scrutiny." My stomach dropped and then twisted itself into a knot. "So I can take it back," I whispered, the words tasting strange in my mouth, like something stolen and sacred. "Yes," Marjorie said, her voice calm but firm. "But you'll need more than just these papers. You'll need to document his breach of intent. You'll need proof that he violated the company's founding principles, moral deterioration, as your grandfather phrased it." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling fan rotating in lazy circles, each blade sweeping the air like the hand of a clock too tired to count the minutes anymore. I thought about what Victor had done, about the people he laid off, about Jorge's poisoned lungs and Carlos collapsing mid-shift. I thought about the reviews, the soulless automation, the pride stripped from every corner of the shop floor. And then I thought about my grandfather. The next morning, I went back to our old family home, the one Victor hadn't bothered to sell yet, probably waiting until he could slap some overpriced granite counters on it and flip it for profit. The place was empty, quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like absence more than peace. I made my way to the study. Everything was covered in plastic sheets, like forgotten furniture at a wake. But the smell was the same: leather, tobacco, cedar. I pulled the dust cover off his old drafting desk and began opening drawers. Third one down, behind a false panel, I found it. A safe. I smiled. He always said, a good builder never trusts a single lock. It was a passcode safe. I tried a few birthdays, then the shop's founding year. Nothing. Finally, I typed in Emilia, my name. The safe clicked open like it had been waiting. Inside was a bundle of letters, wrapped in blue ribbon. The top envelope had my name on it, scrawled in my grandfather's unmistakable pen. "If you're reading this, I was right about you." The letter was short, but every word hit like a hammer to my chest. "I knew you'd find this when the time came. You've always been the one who stayed. The one who watched closely. The one who loved the work, not just the results. Your brother was born with charm, but you were born with foundation. Charm can sell a product, but only foundation can build a legacy." I made sure the papers reflected that. "They'll doubt you. They'll fight you. But remember, this isn't about ownership. It's about stewardship. Build the house. Don't just inherit it." Tears slipped down my cheeks before I realized they were even coming. For the first time in weeks, I felt something cracking open inside me, not rage, not grief, but clarity. This wasn't revenge. This was responsibility. There's a strange stillness that comes with holding power you haven't yet claimed, a quiet intensity, like sitting in the dark with a lit match in your hand, knowing you could burn the whole house down but choosing, instead, to watch and wait. That's where I lived for the next 2 weeks, in that careful silence, holding legal ownership of Torres and Company in my hands while Victor strutted across town like a man who had built the ground he walked on. Marjorie, my attorney, advised me to be patient. She said the smartest way to reclaim a kingdom was not to storm the gates, but to let the ruling tyrant collapse the castle from within. And collapse, he did. Victor launched a flashy new campaign he called Torres Reimagined, complete with LED showroom displays, an Instagram influencer partnership, and an online-only furniture line that claimed to honor tradition through innovation, even though it was mass-manufactured offshore and assembled by part-time staff who didn't know oak from laminate. The local news ate it up. The customers did not. Complaints began flooding in. A beloved church ordered pew benches and received warped, chemically treated composites that smelled like solvent. A high-end bed frame collapsed under a client during a photo shoot, the crossbeam splintering like wet cardboard. Worse still, a whistleblower, an ex-floor worker named Antoine, sent an anonymous tip to the local business bureau. He alleged that Victor's supply chain had begun using substandard, potentially hazardous varnishes banned under state occupational safety laws. The bureau opened an investigation. That same week, one of the warehouse workers was hospitalized for chemical burns to his hands. The local papers, so eager to applaud Victor's modern miracle, turned on him like wind through dry wheat. It was time. I didn't storm in with lawyers or police. I didn't shout or demand apologies. I waited until the date of a scheduled press conference, originally planned for Victor to announce an expansion into national chains, and simply showed up. I walked in through the front entrance of Torres and Company headquarters, wearing the same boots I'd worn every day on the floor for 10 years, my grandfather's letter folded neatly in my breast pocket, and the trust document secure in my briefcase. Victor was standing at the podium, smiling through the tightness of someone who already knew the tide had turned, when I stepped into the back of the room. He glanced up, paused mid-sentence, and for a split second, the color drained from his face. I waited for the right moment. When the PR manager turned to open the floor for questions, I stepped forward, calm and steady, and said, "If I may, I'd like to offer the public a long overdue clarification regarding ownership and stewardship of Torres and Company." The room shifted. The cameras swiveled toward me. The murmur of reporters stilled. Victor stepped back from the mic, eyes wide with dawning realization. "I am Emilia Torres," I began, "and I am the legal majority shareholder and steward of Torres and Company, as per the original Torres Family Legacy Trust. This company was not transferred to my brother. There was no legal succession. He has been acting under a false assumption of authority, which I allowed, for a time, because I believed he might honor the spirit of what our grandfather built." There were audible gasps, but I didn't flinch. My voice didn't shake. But when shortcuts began replacing standards, when legacy was treated like a brand instead of a bond, and when workers were injured due to negligence disguised as innovation, I could no longer remain silent. Victor tried to interrupt. "This is absurd. She has no authority." I turned to him, my tone controlled but unmistakably final. "Victor, the trust document is publicly filed, and my employment record confirms 10 full years of service. Marjorie Lynn, my counsel, has provided copies to the board and the press. It's done." The PR manager didn't know what to do. Cameras kept rolling. I stepped up to the podium. "Effective immediately," I said, "I am reclaiming leadership of Torres and Company. My first action will be a full independent audit of current supply chains, staff contracts, and all pending orders. The second will be an immediate halt to any overseas manufacturing until safety standards are verified. The third," I paused, glancing toward my brother, "will be a reassignment." Victor stiffened. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "You are not being fired," I said carefully, projecting the words with purpose. "You will be reassigned as head of marketing, reporting to the executive board. You will retain your salary and benefits, but your decisions will require oversight. If you accept, we move forward with clarity. If not, we proceed with legal action to recover damages and misappropriated funds." It was the cleanest mercy I could offer, a path forward that allowed him to save face without destroying the very structure he had fractured. I expected rage. Maybe he'd yell, storm out, call me names the way he used to when we were kids and I won at strategy games. Instead, he looked at me, really looked, and I saw something far more hollow than anger. I saw shame. He didn't speak another word. He simply turned, walked away from the mic, and left the room, his footsteps echoing too loudly for a man trying to disappear. That evening, the town buzzed with the news. My phone lit up with texts, calls, even voicemails from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Old floor workers, retired craftsmen, community leaders, they all reached out to say the same thing. Welcome back. But I wasn't done. That Saturday, the community hosted a fundraiser for the local library restoration, an event I used to help plan with my father before he got sick. I showed up early, sleeves rolled up, apron on, helping the kids at the woodworking booth drill tiny birdhouses from leftover shop scraps. People came in waves. Some shook my hand. Some hugged me. Some just smiled, quietly, like they were breathing a little easier now. Later that afternoon, I stepped onto the makeshift stage near the gazebo and tapped the mic. "Thank you all for being here," I said, watching the faces in the crowd, some familiar, some new, all waiting. "It means the world to see this town come together, especially now." I paused. A few days ago, I reclaimed Torres and Company, the company my grandfather started with little more than grit, calluses, and a promise to build something that lasted. Not just furniture, but community, dignity, purpose. Heads nodded in the crowd. I saw Sylvia, Jorge, even Carlos sitting near the front, arms crossed but eyes soft. It's easy, in business, to start chasing numbers so fast you forget what those numbers represent. They're not just revenue lines or production counts, they're people, lives, generations. I looked out over the crowd, trying to find the words that still sat heavy on my chest. My brother made mistakes, but so did I. I stayed silent when I should have spoken. I waited for permission that I didn't need. I thought loyalty meant obedience. It doesn't. I took a breath. Loyalty means showing up. It means preserving the soul of something even when others forget it has one. And leadership means knowing when to hold people accountable, and when to offer them the chance to do better. The crowd was silent. I smiled, just a little. I don't want to run a company that only answers to margins. I want to lead one that answers to people. Starting Monday, we're reopening the original shop floor. We're bringing back the sanding teams. We're reinstating full safety protocols and offering community apprenticeships. Applause broke out. Jorge wiped his eyes. Sylvia clapped so hard she dropped her soda. As the fundraiser wound down, people began lining up to speak with me. They asked questions, offered ideas, told stories I hadn't heard in years about my grandfather's kindness, my father's stubborn integrity, and the company picnics we used to host before efficiency squeezed out tradition. I stood there for hours, listening. Really listening. And for the first time in a long time, I felt not just like I belonged, but like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Not because I inherited a title, but because I had earned it. The sound of sawdust again became familiar. Not just the mechanical hum of machines carving wood, but the more intimate sounds, the quick laugh of an apprentice nicking their first dovetail joint, the soft murmur of old craftsmen debating oak versus ash, and the steady creak of stools as men and women sat elbow to elbow, shaping something permanent with hands that knew patience. The shop was alive again, not just running, not merely functioning, but living. When I first reopened Torres and Company under my leadership, I didn't promise miracles. I made no grand declarations, no flashy rebrands, and certainly no hollow slogans. I promised honesty. I promised safety. I promised that we would remember who we were before profit margins made us forget. And then, quietly and deliberately, I began the work of rebuilding, not the company's name, but its soul. It took weeks to sort through Victor's files, months to renegotiate supplier contracts, replace volatile varnishes with safe materials, and track down every fired employee to offer them not just a job, but a role in something renewed. Some refused, still raw from the sting of the past. Others returned cautiously, testing the water with every step, unsure if change could truly last. But word spread. And they came. The machines stayed, but they moved differently now, not as replacements for people, but as tools to lighten labor, preserve backs and joints, and free up time for the kind of craftsmanship no algorithm could mimic. Jorge helped me design a hybrid workflow, half digital, half hand-tooled, that became the new model. He called it Precision with Pride, and I wrote it on the wall in bold paint, right next to my grandfather's old mantra, built to last, meant to matter. We didn't just rehire, we reinvested. I worked with the local community college to develop an artisan apprenticeship program for high school seniors and young adults who wanted to learn a trade. Each apprentice received a small stipend and access to mentorship, and after a year, they became eligible for full-time positions with profit-sharing options. I offered shares to legacy employees, tying their years of loyalty to actual ownership, not just slogans about being a family. I didn't know how it would be received at first. But when Sylvia's eyes filled with tears after reading the letter offering her 2.5% ownership, I knew I had made the right choice. Victor struggled. There's no kinder way to say it. He floundered beneath the weight of responsibility now constrained by accountability. In marketing, he had no more room for vanity projects or ego-driven pivots. Every campaign had to run through compliance, through ethics checks, and, most painfully for him, through me. The first 2 months were a series of near misses and missed deadlines, and I watched as the charisma he once wielded like a blade dulled in the face of actual structure. Still, I didn't interfere. I let him fail. And then, one afternoon, he nearly tanked a major client campaign by greenlighting an advertisement that used a mocked-up image of a fake product line. It backfired immediately. The client threatened to walk, the community criticized the false branding, and the staff, emboldened now, pushed back hard. Victor didn't come to work the next day, or the day after that. On the third day, I found him sitting on the back porch of the family home, which we still hadn't sold, wearing the same polo shirt he used to wear on launch days, now wrinkled and stained with coffee. "I messed it up," he said, before I even sat down. "Not just the ad. All of it." I didn't respond. I let the silence stretch. Sometimes, silence tells the truth more honestly than any lecture. "I thought leading meant controlling everything," he continued, voice raw, not performative. "I thought if I could outshine everyone, I'd earn the right to be here." He looked at me then, really looked, and his expression held no malice, no defense, only regret. "You earned it, Amelia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not because of luck, not because you waited, but because you showed up. Every single day. When I didn't. When I couldn't." I looked at him for a long time before responding, weighing every emotion that surged through my chest, years of rivalry, betrayal, disappointment. "You don't get to undo what you did," I said quietly. "But you get to decide what you do next." He nodded. And he came back to work. Not with flair, not with bravado, but with a quiet determination that looked nothing like the Victor the first used to know. He started showing up to apprentice trainings. He ran a holiday campaign highlighting the history of hand-finished carving. He even let Jorge fact-check his script before a presentation. I never told him I forgave him. But in time, I think he understood that I did. One Sunday morning, as the workshop slept and the town blinked into sunlight, I visited my grandfather's grave. I hadn't been since the funeral. Part of me always felt he wasn't really there, that his legacy lived in wood grain and weathered hands, not marble and stone. Still, I brought his letters, the ones I found in the safe, and sat cross-legged in the grass beside him. "I hope you knew," I said aloud. "I hope you saw who I became, even before I knew I could." I read him his own words. "You said legacy isn't about who's loudest, but who remembers what it's for." I remember now. I promise, I do. The wind stirred the trees above, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called out. I stayed there a while, not crying, not mourning, just sitting beside the man who started it all, and who, in his quiet way, believed I could finish it better than anyone else. The following week, I walked through the new Torres and Company workshop for the first time without a checklist in my hand. I wasn't there to correct or review. I was just walking. The space buzzed with energy. One of the newer apprentices, Jasmine, a sharp-eyed girl with a steady grip and a sarcastic streak, was hand-rubbing a stain into a cedar cabinet, her mentor watching approvingly beside her. In the back, Carlos laughed as he showed two students how to line up cross-grain cuts without splitting. The lights were warm, the air smelled like oil and hope, and the old bell above the door rang just once, a reminder that time still moved, but so did we. I stopped to shake hands with a young man named Devin, who had just finished his first solo piece, a curved bench with ornate legs and a burned-in family crest on the side. "Looks like something that'll outlast all of us," I said, smiling. He beamed. "I hope so," he said. "That's the point, right?" I nodded, heart full. "Yes," I said, looking around at all we had reclaimed, all we had rebuilt. "That's exactly the point. I wasn't just the owner of Torres and Company anymore. I was its steward, its historian, its future. And I had earned every inch of it, not through rage or revenge, but through roots, through patience, through truth, and through the kind of strength that doesn't need to be shouted to be known." We were no longer just building furniture. We were building legacy.